Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everyone for joining me on another episode as we dive into the history and lore for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 as we gear up for the release of Avowed. For those new to the show wondering why we pair all those shows together, it's because they share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. And so, as the theory goes, if we dive into those Pillars of Eternity games, we can glean some insights into what the world of Eora is like, and therefore appreciate more of what Avowed will be like, and the nuances in the writing and such. But mostly, it's also just a way for those of us who love the lore of this world, who are into this kind of thing, to geek out about it and enjoy ourselves just learning some things about a really cool fantasy setting developed at Obsidian. Today's episode is an extension on my previous episode where I discussed the undead in general, and I was focusing on skeletons in particular. I was talking about the life cycle of the undead creatures that we see in Pillars of Eternity, and therefore how we see them in Avowed, and I briefly discussed liches, and by discussed I mean I briefly just mentioned liches and other forms of undead creatures, but I didn't take the time to actually talk about them. In today's episode, we are actually going to be going into detail on liches and Void Seers and discussing one of the most powerful mages in the world of Eora that is known, whose name is Concelhaut.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
So before we dive straight into the lore that is related to Eora, I just want to quickly talk about what a lich even is. Now, when I say lich, I'm saying the word L-I-C-H. Maybe it's a lick, but I'm going with lich. I know that may not be necessarily correct, but I don't really care. That's what I'm going with. So when I say that, now you know what I mean. If you have experienced fantasy media in any way, shape, or form, you've probably come across this idea of a lich. At one point in time, they were, it was basically just a word that described any kind of undead creature, but as time went on and fantasy stories evolved and there became tropes within the genre, a lich ended up kind of becoming the uber undead, is what I was calling it before. Basically, that really powerful undead character who has immortality, etc., etc. And that's kind of what they have come to known as today. Liches are some of the final bosses in some pre-made Dungeons & Dragons campaigns and in some video games. They can be very powerful creatures of the undead variety. One of the key features of the lich that makes them different from regular undead is their propensity to be immortal. And that's kind of the entire idea of becoming a lich. When you are a person who decides that you're going to move towards becoming this kind of creature, it's about the idea of being made eternal. Looking up a lich on Wikipedia, one paragraph describes them as such. A lich's most often depicted distinguishing feature from other undead in fantasy fiction is the method of achieving immortality. Liches give up their souls to form quote-unquote soul artifacts. This can be something like a soul gem or a phylactery, the source of their magic and their immortality. Many liches take precautions to hide and or safeguard one or more of their soul artifacts that anchor that part of a lich's soul to the material world. If the corporeal body of a lich is killed, that portion of the lich's soul that had remained in the body does not pass on to the next world, but rather exists in a non-corporeal form capable of being resurrected in the near future. The idea of a lich is that you are essentially making yourself immortal because you're making it so that even if your body is slain, your soul will not die, and you can have another body resurrected. And so we see examples of liches within popular culture all the time. I'm not going to mention any of them here because it would actually spoil some narratives, and even if it's old narratives, I don't want to ruin it for people. But this idea that you take your soul, you split it into pieces, you hide it in one or more things, so that your soul's protected from being completely destroyed, and therefore you can live immortally. That's what a lich is classically described as or seen in fantasy fiction. And in the world of Eora, for Pillars of Eternity and likely Avowed, liches follow the same thing. Liches have a phylactery by which they anchor their soul to the material world, which is known as the here, and it causes them from being able to be killed entirely, from their soul to leaving and going to the beyond, and therefore actually dying. On the Pillars of Eternium fandom Wikipedia website, there is an article for liches, and I'm going to be reading from that for most of the information here. A lich is described as a vessel creature, which means that they are an undead creature. So they are not really alive, but they're not fully dead either. That kind of undead category of speaking, like a zombie or a skeleton that can walk around. And this is the background for a lich. Some wizards seek fame, others fortune. Many seek both. For those whom neither will satisfy, there is immortality. Few wizards possess the knowledge to grasp at eternity, and fewer still the fortitude, because the cost is steep indeed. One must sacrifice one's soul. Neither living nor dead, a lich retains their mental acuity but does not hunger for the flesh of kith as undead creatures do. To avoid the decay of undeath, a wizard must bind their soul to their body. However, the process for doing so is unpleasant in the extreme. So before I continue on, so we're given a quick description here of what makes a lich vastly different from a regular undead. And if you remember my previous episode last week, you'll remember that a regular undead creature is characterized by the need to consume living flesh because it is suffused with this living essence, the stuff that souls are made out of, and that living essence stems off this decay and decomposition that an undead creature is undergoing. And so it's in their best interest to consume that essence so that they can, in a quote-unquote, live longer. But a lich doesn't have to worry about that. They don't have the hunger for flesh, and they're not undergoing decomposition, which means they retain their mental acuity. Well, I shouldn't say they don't undergo decomposition. Their body definitely continues to age, and it looks super gross, but they keep all of their mental faculties in check. And so that's one thing that's different from regular undead. The other thing that is different is the process by which you become a lich in this world is very extreme. I mean, becoming an undead creature in the first place is already extreme by many people's standards, but this makes it look relatively accessible, the difference between regular undead and a lich kind of undead. First, they must carve a series of intricate runes into their skull, then overlay that with a complex network of spellwork, and finally complete the transformation by boring a hole into their forehead that they then plug with a large piece of Adra. Okay, so there's a lot there to cover. So if you want to become a lich, you have to do these things. First, you have to carve a series of intricate runes into your skull. All right? There's no way of getting around that. That is already pretty extreme in the first place. Like, you have to, A, know what these intricate runes are and be able to be fluent enough in them that you can carve them into your own skull, which is not a pleasant experience. That right there requires a high skill set, a high tolerance for pain, a dedication, all that kind of stuff. So it's already getting pretty extreme. Once you have carved these intricate runes into your skull, you overlay that with a complex net of spellwork, which again would require you to have a deep understanding of the arcana. And the last thing you have to do to transform this yourself into a lich is you bore a hole into your forehead, and then you plug that hole with a large piece of Adra. Adra in this world is a unique resource. It's like a gemstone, and the unique thing about it is that it can house or transfer soul energy in or through it. And so it's often used in experimentations kind of like this, where it will probably house the soul. And we'll discuss this more as I read on through these paragraphs, but essentially what the Lich is doing at this point is they are turning their own head into a phylactery. They are binding their soul to their skull in such a way that it cannot leave, and they are holding it there. The Adra is a required piece of that because Adra houses soul essence. The runes and the spellwork are probably there to cause this to happen in the first place. It's almost like the runes and the spellwork create the binding between your skull and your soul, and then the Adra holds it all in place. That's kind of how I would picture it, but we're not actually privy to the information of how it's supposed to go, and very likely the developers at Obsidian didn't have a specific method in mind. This seemed like the steps to do. What drives a wizard to become a lich? The reasons are as varied as the wizards themselves. One might fear death, while another might fear being bested by a rival. Still, another may desire only the ability to continue their work, amassing ever greater knowledge of the nature of essence and the runes and incantations required to master it. Whatever their reasons, all liches develop the characteristic form of their kind as their bodies rapidly wither and age. Their skin grows thin, almost translucent, stretched across their bones like a thin film of algae spread across a pond. What hair remains runs white. Their body cools until it touches hold the warmth of glacier ice. And in the end, only their magic, might, and malice remain. So this first part of what I just read talks about the motivation for becoming a lich. And these are the pretty classical motivations that you see in fantasy literature. Usually it's wizards, someone who's a master of the arcane, who just doesn't want to die. They're afraid of death. Or they don't want to be beaten by someone, so they want to stay alive longer so that they can destroy their rival. Or it's just wanting to continue their work, because wizards in these fantasy worlds tend to be very dedicated to their work, and their work potentially spans generations, and they're unwilling to pass that work on to somebody else. They want to continue it themselves, and so they find a way to gain immortality so they can continue doing it. These are 3 common reasons that I see for people becoming liches, even outside of this fantasy world. Their body continues to wither and age, and so it looks super gross. Their skin basically just holding and sagging on like algae over a pond. Their hair is white, their skin is very, very cold, and as described at the end of these statements, only their magic, might, and malice remain. And so it doesn't sound like liches are all necessarily the greatest of people. If a lich body is destroyed, they become a Void Seer, which is a floating skull. So that's the background behind liches, what they are. And we're going to talk about Void Seers in a second, but I'm not done with all the lore on liches. We've already discussed what a lich is in general, but there's a few more paragraphs of lore here that kind of just go a little bit more in depth on the particulars of lichdom, if you will. Liches are as formidable as they are rare. So they're not very easy to find. You don't see a lot. In fact, in the games, you only run into one, as far as I understand it. Although there might be like a lich battle mage or something, I can't recall. They're masters of the arcane who have discovered ways to extend their own lives without facing the mental deterioration of Fampyrs and other vessels, such as undead skeletons and all that, like I was talking about before. There are no reliable records or accounts of how to become a lich. The few who've managed to succeed have been hesitant to share their methods, but it's believed that the process is both difficult and excruciating. The annals of wizardry are littered with cautionary tales of ambitious mages who attempted immortality, but managed only to rip their own bodies apart. So this lore is obviously coming from a source that has not learned what we learned from the previous paragraphs. However, we do learn that particular information that I've already read from one of the mages of the world that we're talking about, Concelhaut, and we'll get to him in a minute. While liches decay physically, they retain their mental faculties, which is part of what separates them from vessels, just regular other undead. They achieve this by binding their own essence to phylacteries, which are popularly represented as vials or charms worn or kept close to the body. However, none of the few known liches have ever revealed the nature or location of their phylacteries, so theories about them are ultimately speculation. Now again, we've already discussed this, that what Concelhaut and other liches probably do in this world is their phylactery is their own skull. But technically speaking, a phylactery can be anything. So it could be a vial or a charm that you wear around your neck or something like that. The only problem with things like that is that they are a lot more prone to destruction, I guess you could say, than other things, such as your skull. Most liches are believed to be powerful wizards or mages, but this is a generalization rather than a rule. One lich who lived almost 1,000 years ago was a priestess of Barath, and who was sustained through her own rigorous devotion. Animancers have been rumored to experiment with similar concepts, but given the profession's questionable reputation, none have been willing to admit this. And so that last part is just kind of like, I guess, breaking a trope of liches, is that it's always wizards. Wizards are the people who become liches, but it's like actually anyone can do it, as long as they have learned the thing that they need to learn. Now, statistically speaking, it would be a wizard, because who would know the complex runes? Who would know the complex spell work that needs to be done? A wizard, very likely. But in this case, apparently 1,000 years ago, a priestess of Barath had these skills available to become a lich. Now, the only lich that we run into within the game is Concelhaut. He's the only one that's encountered. Concelhaut is one of the Archmage of Eora. Well, I don't know if he's an Archmage as in he's in the circle of Archmage, but he is definitely as powerful as one of the members within the circle of Archmage, which is a faction within the world of Eora. Before we talk about Concelhaut, let's quickly talk about what a Void Seer is. A Void Seer is a particular type of enemy. It's a vessel creature, so therefore it's undead, just like, undead skeletons and liches and Fampyrs and all that. And when a lich dies, and they've used their skull as a phylactery, then they become a Void Seer. This is the description of a Void Seer. Animancers, necromancers, and other unscrupulous spellcasters. Animancers, by the way, are essentially scientists that study the soul, who experiment with the bodies of the kith, have been known to create all sorts of constructs and vessels. Some exist as subjects for study, and others as sources for amusement. Void Seers are skulls filled with essence. And again, essence is the name of the stuff that souls are made of. So these skulls are filled with soul energy, if you will. The first accounts of Void Seers come from Old Valia, which is a older faction within the World of Eora, where a now infamous necromancer created them as a diversion for court. Since then, they've been used as patrols, guards, and attendants. Their small size makes them easier to create and direct. So Void Seers are essentially just floating skulls. They float around, they have soul energy, this essence inside of them, which powers them, keeps them alive, quote unquote, and they can be an annoying nuisance of an enemy, although you do see them when you're at a higher level, at least if I remember correctly in the game. I ran into them at a much later level, so this isn't something you want to run into at a lower level. I love the first accounts of Void Seers that it was some dude in Old Valia who would bring them to court as a distraction. I find that hilarious. Just a bunch of these skulls floating around for the sake of distraction. But that's what a Void Seer is, and that is what a Lich will turn into after their body is destroyed. Now, this description makes it seem like Void Seers are a little more mindless, that they don't have much thought to them, but I imagine that a Lich turned into a Void Seer has much more rationality and cognitive function. Now, with that said, let's dive into the Archmage of Concelhaut and talk about his story.
A soul full of divine riddles. Did you come seeking answers? Or are the forces that set your path a mystery even to you?
Concelhaut is one of the most powerful mages in Eora. He spent a lifetime studying magic, and he creates many spells. In fact, if you are playing as a wizard or a lot of spellcasting types within Pillars of Eternity, you have access to some of Concelhaut's spells. Many spells in this world are named after the person who invented them. So, for instance, in terms of Concelhaut, you have access to spells like Concelhaut's Corrosive Siphon, Concelhaut's Parasitic Staff, Concelhaut's Draining Touch, Concelhaut's Crushing Doom, and Concelhaut's Draining Missiles. You can kind of detect a pattern with Concelhaut's magical spells. They usually, in some way or another, tend to drain essence, energy, or life force, whatever, from one target and brings it to you. So it's all about draining, siphoning, and stuff like that. So this tends to be his area of focus. So he's created a lot of spells. And when you create spells, that's kind of what makes you an Archmage. That's how you know you're powerful, when people are casting spells that are named after you. He extended his life by pouring his soul into a phylactery. And so there you go. You have Concelhaut. He's become a Lich. So it's just kind of casually written there. Concelhaut is a lifelong rival of Lengreth, one of the other Archmages of the world, and the other Archmages who have tried to take him down by any means necessary, including hiring a mercenary army that Concelhaut dismisses as merely a nuisance. You actually get to experience this in Pillars of Eternity 1, the White March DLC. At one point, you can go seek out Concelhaut, and there's an entire mercenary army going after him just to take this one guy down, and he's just kind of annoyed that they're there. Like, that's how powerful this guy is. Actually, Concelhaut is so powerful that he has a sky dragon eyeball in his office when you go to see him. That's something you can notice in the background. It's not said whether or not he traded for it, but very likely he killed a sky dragon and took the eyeball. So he's at least as powerful as one sky dragon on his own, and that's something to say right there. He's ultimately trying to discover time manipulation, which has been pioneered by other Archmages such as Caldebald the Red and Mara of the Seven Hills. And he wants to become uber powerful, right? That's like what a lot of wizards like this person want to do. But in order to do what he needs a soul that can draw on the power of the Ether. such as a Watcher's Soul. And if you've played Pillars of Eternity, you'll remember that you are a Watcher character, which is why Concelhaut's very interested in stealing your soul. But this is Concelhaut. He's a very powerful mage. He studies corrosive and siphoning magic. He is pretty much antagonistic to the rest of the circle of Archmagi. He is not benevolent. He is malevolent, if anything else. And he has subjected himself to lichdom. So he has carved the runes in his skull. He has laid that network of spells across of his skull, and he has borne a hole and put a piece of Audra inside of it. So he is a lich now. He is undead. And if you succeed in killing him, you actually get an item from him called Concelhaut's Skull, which is classified as a pet in the first game, so you can just have this skull floating around following you, which your character can detect the power and energy of Concelhaut still on the side of it, but they don't really do anything for the rest of the game. However, it's kind of hilarious in how the story goes from here. And so the story of Concelhaut actually gets more interesting with the second Pillars of Eternity game. In the first Pillars of Eternity game, he is merely a lich who is super powerful, big bad guy. You gotta go take him out. And he's so powerful that he looks at an entire mercenary army and just sort of doesn't care. It's not a big deal for him. That's how powerful this guy is. And you kill this guy, and then you get to take his skull as a pet afterwards. So long story short, Concelhaut's skull is still infused with his spirit. And so as it turns out, Concelhaut is still completely sentient and aware of his surroundings while inside of his own skull. But he can't really do anything because he's just a skull. And so, he gets hanging around in your bag, so he's just kind of bouncing around your weapons and armor. He gets thrown in a storage room somewhere, etc., etc. And of course, he's got all these plans on gaining his power back and killing you and blah, 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 blah. In Pillars of Eternity 2, you do run into him again, and he has a body, and you're like, what's going on? I killed you already. I have your skull back at my keep, except my keep was destroyed. And it's revealed that he, apparently, when he was just at Cadnua, which is the stronghold that you owned in the first Pillars of Eternity game, he had all of these plans to gain power back. He was going to destroy your stronghold, and he was going to kill you, etc., etc. But then at the beginning of Pillars of Eternity 2, of course, your stronghold's completely destroyed by the god Aethys, and so he wasn't able to do that. But what he decided to do, kind of detecting the power that was in the Deadfire Archipelago, he dragged his skull form, described here, one mouthful of soil at a time, to the Deerwooden shore so that he could gain passage by boat to the Deadfire Archipelago. And we don't understand what happened to him then. This guy, as just a skull, managed to get him from one continent to a completely separate area of the world, and managed to gain his power back, managed to revive a body, and continue his work. And of course, come after you because, he doesn't like you after what you did. You can pay him back, however, if you decide that, poor Concelhaut, he's gone through enough in this world, and you can give him a titanic body of a former god. I'm not going to give away any of the details of how or why or where, just in case there's any new players out there, but you can basically give him the body of a god down the road if you really want to be on Team Concelhaut in the second game. That's up to you. I'm not going to tell you what to do or not, but yeah, that's the story of Concelhaut. It's not a very long story, which is good because I'm already kind of running around the regular showtime at this point. But it's a satisfying one. I love the person's determination to I'm gonna get this guy. I'm gonna, even if I have to eat soil and cross this continent one mouthful of soil at a time, I'm gonna get to the Deadfire. I'm gonna become a person again. It's hilarious to me. And so that's Concelhaut, and those are Lichs and Void Seers. Now let's ask the obvious question. What does this have to do with Avowed?
Is an oath worth the weight of a crown?
I ask this question every single time, and I realized one day Avowed's going to come out, and then I'm going to have a different segment for this part of the show. Anyways, I'm just sort of talking to myself at this point. So what does this all have to do with Avowed? Well, in regards to Lichs, Void Seers, and Concelhaut, a Void Seer is a regular type of enemy which I could see making an appearance in Avowed. There's no reason something like that could not happen. So if we see we could very well see Void Seer enemies, which are just floating skulls, really. So as cool as they are, that might not be the most special thing. It depends how powerful they're made in Avowed. A Lich, on the other hand, is a very rare occurrence in the world, but that doesn't mean that it won't occur in Avowed. And I kind of half expect us to run into a Lich at some point in time. Whether or not it will become like one or two liches that exist and they're like minor bosses or mini bosses before something else, or if they are main bosses for large arcs of the narrative, I don't know. My personal speculation is that perhaps one of the DLCs for Avowed might feature a lich as a major enemy, because whatever the narrative for the main line of Avowed is going to be, we're going to resolve that in our first playthrough. But then what are we going to have for DLC? Well, a lich enemy just makes a lot of sense. And bringing Concelhaut back into the equation, there's no reason it couldn't be Concelhaut, right? Depending on when and where Avowed takes place within the history of Eora, there's no reason that a Concelhaut couldn't make an appearance in the Living Lands. It does depend a little bit, I suppose, on whether or not he's in his skull form state after the Watcher destroys him in Pillars of Eternity 1, unless the developers at Obsidian decide that they just want to make it canon, or at least canon for this game, that Concelhaut wasn't killed by the Watcher and got away. That doesn't have to be like a solid canon. It could just be like a for this game only kind of thing. That kind of canon does exist in fiction. We do see that in fantasy quite a lot, where some things are made canon for certain games and some things are made canon for other games. So who knows? But Concelhaut could make an appearance. I don't necessarily know if he's going to be in the base game. He could, because he is featured in Pillars of Eternity 2, and Carrie Patel, the lead director for this game, said that there's a couple of characters from the second Pillars game that are going to be in Avowed. But we also see Concelhaut in the first game, and since she mentioned the second game specifically, it makes me think maybe we won't be seeing Concelhaut. But perhaps he'll come back in a DLC as a major bad guy that you get to face down or something like that. Who knows? So we could see any of these. I think least likely we'll see Concelhaut. Decent chance we'll see a lich. We might not. I'm not going to set that expectation up. But a lich is a very good, reliable go-to for an uber bad guy to have for a side quest or a DLC. So there's a decent chance. And I would say there's a fairly higher chance that we'll run into Void Seers within the game. It just depends on what kind of enemies and what kind of story Avowed is telling. That's everything for today's episode. Thanks everyone for joining me as we discuss Lichs, Void Seers, and Concelhaut. This has been a lot of fun, just kind of looking at that side of fantasy today, talking about undead creatures and the bestiary and specific mages within this world and kind of how things work. I like that the lore is sensible in a way that like A leads to B leads to C. There's reasons for why things happen, and I like that a lot. If you enjoyed today's episode, send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com, or hit me up on Twitter @worldofeora. I mostly just post updates for when shows come out, but if anything new happens on the horizon, I'll be sure to let you know there. As for myself, nothing new to really talk about that will be that interesting to you guys. I recently picked up 2 games on Steam. One is an older game called Antechamber, and a second game is much newer, is called Viewfinder. There was a game that came out on Xbox Game called Maquette, I believe is how it's pronounced, which is a first-person recursive puzzle game, which I've been enjoying, but it didn't have the... And this is weird to say about a puzzle game, but it didn't have a punchiness to it. Like, everything just kind of flowed from one puzzle to the next. It seemed obvious what to do. And that's not me saying I'm smart. Like, I haven't even gotten a quarter of the way through the game, but it didn't have a lot of staying power with me. But it gave me a craving again for a good puzzle game, or something mind-bending. Like, I really enjoyed the Portal games. I really love Superliminal. One of my favorite games of all time is The Witness. And I heard about Antechamber, never purchased it, and I went and bought it, and so glad I did. That game is upside down and backwards in so many ways. It's a game where you really have to learn the rules of the game, but it doesn't tell you what the rules of the game are. So you got to figure out these puzzles, but you don't yet understand the physics of what's going on. It's very non-Euclidean in a lot of ways. As well, the game Viewfinder, which is kind of like Superliminal in a way, but I would say a little bit more grounded, perhaps, which is a weird thing to say about Superliminal and Viewfinder. In Viewfinder, you are in this giant simulation trying to solve the crisis of climate change, etc., which is kind of disjointed from the main gameplay mechanic, if I might add. But anyways, I don't want this to go on too long. You take photographs, and then you hold a photograph up in front of your character's face, and you're looking at it, and the world is behind you, and then you can click a button on your controller, on your keyboard, and the photograph is then superimposed onto the world, right? So you're like looking at this 2D image on your screen, and then boom, all of a sudden that 2D photograph is superimposed into the 3-dimensional world, and you can now walk into the photo as if it was 3-dimensional. It kind of erases everything that was in its path, etc., and things like that. But it's been an interesting mechanic. I love seeing games experiment with this kind of thing, and it's been a lot of fun to play around with. I'm just kind of trying to find short puzzle games to play until Baldur's Gate 3 comes out, which I know a lot of you guys are excited for. Anyways, that's what I've been playing. Sorry, that section doesn't usually go this long, but if you enjoyed that, thanks for listening to me ramble. If you've been playing anything similar or you have any recommendations for me on games I ought to play, send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. Let me know if you're excited for Baldur's Gate 3 as well, because I'm basically just holding out at this point till that game comes out. Thanks everyone for listening to today's episode. I've been your host, Eric, aka Junior Reno. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.